Ever find yourself at the checkout, groceries piled up, and you pull out your debit card without even thinking twice about it?
It's something most of us do every day.
Exactly. But what if I told you that simple swipe could be at the center of a legal battle? One that could completely change how we pay for, well, pretty much everything.
That's what we're diving into today. A deep dive into the U.S. Department of Justice's antitrust lawsuit against, you guessed it, Visa.
And we're not talking about some small-time legal squabble here. This is about some serious accusations of power plays in the financial world.
Big time. Luckily, we've got this article, Visa's Antitrust Lawsuit by the DOJ, to help us unpack it all.
So, cut to the chase for us. What's the gist? What exactly is the DOJ accusing Visa of doing?
At its core, the DOJ is claiming that Visa is using its massive influence, its market power, to stifle competition in the debit card market. We're talking about practices that could be costing businesses, and potentially even you and me, a whole lot of money.
Okay, so let's get specific. What kind of shady business are we talking about here? This article mentions exclusive agreements. What's the deal with those?
All right, so picture this. The DOJ is alleging that Visa goes to merchants and banks and basically strong-arms them into these exclusive agreements. These agreements, they essentially box out any alternative payment networks.
So if a business tries to, step outside the Visa lane and embrace a different payment system.
Exactly. The DOJ claims Visa slams them with higher fees. But if they stay loyal to Visa, well, they get rewarded. It's all about maintaining their grip on the market.
It's like if your grocery store suddenly started charging you double if you dared to use a credit card that wasn't their store brand.
It's a pretty raw deal. And the DOJ is saying it's all part of Visa's strategy to maintain its dominance, even if it means squeezing out competition and potentially harming businesses and consumers in the process.
So the DOJ is painting Visa as this big bad wolf, but they're not the only player in the game, right? I mean, MasterCard's a thing, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. MasterCard is a major competitor. But here's the thing. Visa still controls a massive chunk of the debit card market. We're talking over 60%. That's like 2 out of every 3 times you use your debit card.
Wow. That is a lot of swipe.
It's a staggering number. And globally, get this, there are over 3.2 billion Visa debit cards out there.
Okay, those are some seriously impressive, or maybe scary impressive numbers. But you mentioned other players like MasterCard. They're a pretty big deal too.
Right, without a doubt. And actually, they've been growing at a really impressive pace, their revenue growth. It's actually outpacing Visa's. And they've been steadily chipping away at Visa's market share, especially when it comes to debit cards.
Oh, really? I had no idea. So how much have they grown?
Back in 2005, they held about 21% of the market. Now it's closer to 27%.
So they're gaining ground. Does that weaken the DOJ's argument?
It's not that cut and dry, unfortunately. Antitrust laws, they're designed to prevent monopolies. Situations where one company has this, stranglehold on the market and just chokes out any competition. It's not just about being big, though. It's whether a company abuses its size to squash competition. That's the key question here.
So it's not enough for the DOJ to just say, look how big Visa is. They've got to prove that Visa isn't just a big fish, but that they're actively harming the entire pond's ecosystem. How do they do that when you have competitors like MasterCard still swimming around?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, that's what makes this case so fascinating. It's going to be really interesting to see how this all plays out in court.
I'm already hooked. But let's not forget about us regular folks who are stuck in the middle of this financial showdown. What does all of this legal back and forth actually mean for us? I mean, are we the ones swiping our debit cards for our morning coffee and online shopping sprees going to feel the pinch if the DOJ gets its way?
That's what everyone wants to know, and it's a question we're going to unpack in just a bit. Stay tuned.
So we've got this high-stakes legal battle, the DOJ throwing some pretty hefty accusations at Visa, and Visa firing back saying, hey, we're just doing business as usual. But let's cut through the legal jargon for a second. What does this actually mean for us, the average Joes and Janes? Are we the ones who mindlessly swipe our debit cards without a second thought going to start feeling the pinch if the DOJ gets their way?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it all comes down to this. The DOJ's argument hinges on the idea that if merchants are stuck with these potentially unfair fees from Visa, those costs are eventually going to trickle down to us, the consumers.
So you're saying we could be looking at a world where using our debit cards for everyday purchases starts to feel a little less, well, convenient because everything's just a tad pricier.
Precisely. Imagine a world where your morning coffee or that quick grocery run ends up costing you just a little bit more, all because those transaction fees have gone up.
Death by 1,000 swipes. Not exactly a fun thought. But you did mention earlier that the link between those fees and what we actually pay at the register isn't always crystal clear, right?
Exactly. It's not as simple as Visa raises fees, consumers pay more. It's a much more complex ecosystem. You see, if a business gets hit with these higher transaction fees, they've got options. They could raise prices and pass that cost directly on to you, the customer. But they might also decide to eat some of that cost themselves.
So they might accept a smaller profit margin or find savings elsewhere.
Exactly. It's not always as straightforward as it seems.
That's a really good point. It's easy to just assume businesses will pass any increased cost directly onto the consumer, but it's obviously a lot more nuanced than that. There are other factors at play.
Absolutely. And here's another layer to consider. What happens when Visa lowers their fees? Do those savings always trickle down to us? It's a two-way street. It's this intricate dance between businesses trying to stay afloat and consumers trying to, well, afford their daily lives.
A delicate dance indeed. And it sounds like the DOJ's argument is that Visa is calling all the shots in this dance, ultimately tipping the scales against both businesses and consumers.
That's the crux of their argument. They're saying that Visa holds too much power and that this lack of a truly level playing field is ultimately harming everyone except, well, Visa.
So we've heard the prosecution's side of the story, but what about the defense? What's Visa's response to all of this? They're not just sitting back and taking it, are they?
Oh, absolutely not. Visa is vehemently denying these allegations, calling them completely baseless. They're essentially arguing that everything they're doing is standard industry practice.
So they're pulling the everyone else is doing it card.
Pretty much. They're saying, hey, volume discounts, those are common. We're not doing anything out of the ordinary here.
Right, because everyone loves a good volume discount.
Mhm.
But it sounds like they're also trying to shift the narrative away from this whole monopoly talk and focus on the value they bring to the table.
Exactly. They're emphasizing the positives. They point to their massive, reliable network, the security they provide, the ease of use. They're saying, look, we're not perfect, but we're providing an essential service here.
And they're not wrong about that. I mean, think about it. When was the last time you actually used cash for something? We rely on these systems, these networks, constantly.
Precisely. They built this incredibly efficient, incredibly widespread system, and it's become deeply ingrained in our daily lives. And that's what makes this whole case so compelling. It forces us to really examine this trade-off.
Convenience versus control.
Exactly. Are those benefits, the ease, the reliability, are they worth the potential downsides of reduced competition in the market? It's a question that goes way beyond just Visa.
It feels like this case is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. We're seeing governments around the world start to really scrutinize the power of big tech and these major financial institutions. There's a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, these companies have gotten a little too big, a little too influential, and they haven't been held accountable for their impact on consumers or the market.
You're hitting on something really important here. This isn't happening in a vacuum. This case, this whole debate about Visa, it's a microcosm of a much larger shift that's happening. It's like the wild, wild west out there. But instead of saloons and showdowns at high noon, we've got algorithms and online transactions. And it feels like the sheriff might finally be stepping in to say, hold on a minute, let's make sure everyone's playing by the rules here.
And as always, it seems like it's the biggest, most powerful players who end up in the spotlight first.
It's true. We've seen it with the DOJ going after Google for their dominance in digital advertising. We saw it with Apple facing heat for how they control the App Store. And now, well, it's Visa's turn in the hot seat.
A high-stakes game of financial chess, and the tension is palpable. But let's bring it back down to earth for a moment. Why should we, the average people scrolling through our news feeds, even care about this? We're not CEOs or lawyers, so what's the takeaway for the average person?
Here's why it matters. The outcome of this case could have some major ripple effects, and those ripples, they could reach all of us.
Okay, so walk us through it. What happens if the DOJ wins? What happens if Visa wins? What are the possible scenarios here?
Let's say the DOJ wins. That's huge. That could set a major precedent, potentially leading to stricter regulations for all payment networks, not just Visa.
Yeah.
We could see a whole wave of new rules about transaction fees, exclusive agreements, you name it. It would be a clear signal that the government is serious about reining in the power of these financial giants.
So a win for the DOJ could fundamentally reshape the entire playing field. What about the flip side? What happens if Visa comes out on top?
Well, win for Visa, that would be a blow to the DOJ's efforts to regulate big tech in the financial industry. It might send the message that proving antitrust violations in these complex, constantly evolving digital spaces is just too difficult, to uphill a battle. And that could embolden other companies, other giants, to push the boundaries even further, knowing that the legal ground is a bit shaky.
So it's about more than just Visa. It's about the future of how we do business, how much control these large companies have, and ultimately what role the government plays in all of it. It's about finding that balance.
Exactly. It's about the balance of power in our increasingly digital economy, and that's something that affects every single one of us, whether we realize it or not.
So we're left with this question, convenience or control? It feels like we're constantly trying to find that balance, especially when it comes to these massive companies that are so ingrained in our daily lives.
Absolutely. In this case with Visa, it really highlights how those lines can get blurry. On the one hand, we've got this incredibly convenient system, a system that most of us use every single day without a second thought. But then we have to ask ourselves, at what cost?
Exactly, because convenience is great, but not if it comes at the expense of, well, everything else. It's like, are we so hooked on the ease of swiping a card that we're willing to overlook some of these bigger questions about competition and control and fairness?
It's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
And it's easy to feel like these are issues that are, I don't know, beyond our control. We're not the ones making these deals, writing these regulations. But the reality is, consumers have a lot more power than we often realize.
So what can we do? What can the average person do to make sure their voice is heard in all of this?
It starts with awareness. The more you understand how these systems work, the more informed your choices become. And those choices, they matter. Support businesses that offer alternative payment options. Let your elected officials know that you care about these issues. Don't underestimate the power of your voice, of your vote, of your wallet.
You're right. Voting with our wallets, it's a powerful tool. And at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do here on the deep dive, right? Giving you the information you need to make those informed decisions.
Absolutely. Because knowledge is power.
Yeah.
And the more we know about these systems, the more empowered we are to demand change, to create a system that's fair and transparent for everyone.
So the next time you pull out your debit card, maybe take a second, just a moment, to think about the journey it took to get there, the companies, the agreements, the regulations, the entire system that makes that simple transaction possible. Because it's in those moments of awareness that we realize we're not just passive consumers along for the ride. We have a say in how this story unfolds.
Well said. And then that's what I hope our listeners take away from this conversation. It's not about pointing fingers or demonizing any one company. It's about fostering a deeper understanding of these complex systems that shape our world, that shape our wallets, and recognizing that we all have a role to play in shaping the future.
It's about asking those tough questions, staying informed, and never being afraid to dive deeper. And on that note, this has been The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper.